So we've learned a lot about how we make an X-ray beam, how we control the X-ray beam. We learned a lot about the nature of digital images last class, and we spent some time talking about how we change radiographic technique to adapt to digital radiography. Eventually, we won't have to talk about this anymore. Give it another 10 years and we won't have to talk about how things are different from film because no one will be using film anymore. But we still do, anyways. So let's talk about capturing the digital image. Let's get some terms down. So CR. CR stands for computed radiography. To be clear, both of these, CR and DR, are considered digital radiography. So DR does not mean digital radiography. DR means something different. I'll get to that in a second. So it's all digital, okay? CR is one type of digital, standing for computerized or computed radiography. The thing to remember here is that the image receptor has no direct connection to the processor. It's like a film cassette in that it has to be taken from where the patient is over to the processor and placed in the processor. This was originally called filmless radiography. Left that open, sorry. This was originally called filmless radiography because it was like film, but we just didn't use a piece of film. We had something called an imaging plate, an image plate, or IP. Whereas DR stands for direct capture, or I just usually refer to it as direct radiography, okay? Converse, or opposite to CR, there is a direct connection between the image receptor and the computer, okay? This does not require the image receptor to be carried to a processor separate from the exposure unit. The IR, image receptor, is directly connected electronically or electromagnetically by like Wi-Fi to the processor. It used to be the case that DR was so expensive that it was cost prohibitive for smaller offices to switch over. CR was cheaper, DR was more expensive. It has now become the case that so many companies have gotten into the field that you know when a lot of companies get into a field and start producing stuff, the price for the items kind of go down, right? If there's a lot of competition, the prices go down. So that's the case right now. DR is actually cheaper or very similarly priced to CR in a lot of cases. So the office is like a no-brainer for offices. They're going to DR because it's just better in a lot of ways. The only reason why somebody would have bought CR in the past was that it was a cheaper option. Okay, and it's maybe a little bit less of there's less components that can be damaged, less maintenance maybe, right? But the main thing was the cost in the past, and that's kind of going away now, which is really nice for you guys because DR is just so great. I got a chance to work on it for the first time in 2016, and I just remember it was amazing. Like not having to take the cassette out from under the patient and take it to a processor is absolutely huge and game changing, right? Being able to stay in the room after you make the exposure, like tell the patient to relax, but stay in the room and just watch the image populate on the screen rather than having to do all this stuff to go get the receptor and put it in the processor, hope you put it in right, hope that the processor doesn't screw up and like eat the cassette on the way, eat the imaging plate and make some issues or accidentally erase the image or some funky thing to happen, right? A lot of that's taken out of the equation. Now, the original DR systems were directly connected. In some cases, they were actually fixed in place. Like there was a bucky, and the DR plate was fixed in place in the bucky. You couldn't remove it. In other cases, the DR plate was movable, but it was connected by an actual cable to the processor, to the computer. Nowadays, most DR cassettes communicate wirelessly with the computer. So yeah, if you had a fixed system, you had one in the table and one on the wall. Two separate plates that just never came out. Nowadays, it's much more common because DR has to be adapted to rooms that are already there, right? So it's much more common for a DR plate to just be a plate with communicates wirelessly with the receptor, and it fits in our bucky trays. You all right? Yeah. Okay, just making sure. Good. Okay, so good. So for DR. And this is not necessarily the case nowadays, but we'll just say it. For DR, the radiographic table or chest board used to house a permanent array of miniature radiation detectors. Okay, it was like having a plate but fixed in place. Okay, again, now it's becoming much more common for them to be an actual plate that you can move. The fixed DR, if you have a fixed DR system, which are probably still out there in use, right? This, by the way, these lecture notes are not that old. So this stuff has been changing pretty rapidly. These are only a few years old. So the fixed nature of this system can limit positioning flexibility somewhat. You know, you with a fixed system, you can't take the plate and put it on the tabletop. There is no plate to put on the tabletop with fixed DR. Okay, so you're gonna have to learn that there's different types of these direct radiography systems. Another comparison difference is, how many of you guys who have CR, where you actually take the plate to the processor, how many of you guys that have that take multiple projections on one plate? Does anyone do that? And let's start with Taylor. What's one advantage of doing that?
Well, it's all on one thing, so you don't have to go back and forth.
Yeah. So it's only process the plate one time.
So
Lewis.
like a finger, like you have like the AP, lateral, oblique.
Right, all on one plate, and you did it with 3 exposures, and you only brought the receptor to the processor one time. What's another advantage? I think of at least one other advantage. Same thing. So the other advantage is kind of, it's in the same vein, but the other main advantage is when the image is displayed, the physician doesn't have to toggle between images to see all 3 at one time. Okay. I will say a disadvantage with multiple fields of projection on one plate. So this is taking a single imaging plate, making one projection in one spot, another projection in another spot, and then a third projection in a completely different spot on the imaging plate, having 3 exposures on one plate with CR. You can do that with CR, you can do that with film, okay? There's a distinct disadvantage to this. The disadvantage is that if the radiologist or physician wants to window level one of those projections, they end up window leveling all of them. Right. So that's a disadvantage. Nowadays, we have image stitching, we have side-by-side viewing software, so we don't have to worry about that so much. Do you know why we do it? It's not for ease of use. We did it. It's an old. It's a reason from film radiography. Has anyone ever told you guys why we do multiple on one plate? So it was to save film. Remember, with film radiography, your piece of film was a piece of film, and when you used it for a single image, it was used, right? And every piece of film costs $1 or $2 or $3, right? So you're saving a couple bucks every time you condense projections onto one piece of film. It was a money-saving technique for offices, okay? That's all it was ever meant to be. With CR, there was really no reason to do it. I guess if I have to give you one reason why it was useful, the CR imaging plates were kind of like film in that, so a film's single use, right? But a CR plate can be reused. They can't be reused indefinitely. They can be reused maybe 3,000 to 5,000 times, depending on which manufacturer it is. 3,000 to 5,000 exposures. That sounds like a lot, but that's like a year's worth of exposures on a single plate, right? So the plates have to be replaced on like a yearly basis. If you condensed images onto one plate, then you were kind of saving the usable life of the plate. Think about it as like wear and tear, right? Reducing wear and tear. So that was a thing. But here's the deal. With DR, because DR plates are connected directly to a processor, as soon as you make an exposure, the information about that exposure is immediately and directly communicated with to the computer, and the image is brought up on the computer screen within seconds. There is no time or chance for you to make multiple exposures on one field. So all of your images on DR are done as a single field, a single light field, centered, okay? And you're usually having to center to one of the AEC detector cells. Remember those 3 rectangles I showed you earlier? That's with fixed DR. With movable DR cassettes, you can put them on the tabletops now, which is very nice. DR cassettes operate at a consistent speed class. So again, think about speed class as the speed with which a piece of film would expose itself, okay? So what I mean is, think about just a film camera, right? How do film cameras work? Well, they have an aperture, right, an opening, and then behind that opening is a piece of film, okay? And when you press click on a film camera, right, the aperture opens a certain amount to let a certain amount of light in, and it opens for a certain amount of time. So you have an exposure time and an aperture size, right? Among other settings, those are 2 important things for film cameras: the amount of time the opening opens for, and so there's light hitting a piece of film for a certain amount of time and a certain amount of light, okay? Speed class for film and film cameras was a way to control how fast the exposure could be made, okay? So consider like speed classes came in numbers of like 100, 200, 300, 400, and so on, okay? A 100 speed film for a film, just think camera right now, a 100 speed film for a camera would expose slowly. So you would need to make longer exposure times. Okay, your exposure time would have to be longer for a 100 speed film versus a 200 or 300 speed film. But the advantage was you were able to achieve better quality images. Again, you're still thinking film cameras, photography. Okay. If you instead bought a 200 speed film, you were able to make the exposure quicker. So in conditions of good enough light, you were able to make the exposure much quicker. Okay? Or sorry, in the conditions of low light, you were able to make the exposures faster, but you sacrificed image quality. Okay, so speed class of film was taken from film photography, where we wanted to be able to control how fast our film and cameras was able to be exposed. Okay, and we gained or lost detail in that same way. Transfer that over to film radiography, and we chose speed classes for that same reason, right? A low speed film would be for like a hand, where the hand's not going to move, okay? You can make long exposure times and get good detail with a low speed film. A high speed film in radiography was useful when you had body parts that move. A chest x-ray, for example, right? The heart beats in the chest and you can't stop that. You can't politely ask the patient to, hey, pause your heart for a minute, right? So what do? You use a fast speed film and you make the exposure times very short. You are sacrificing some image quality there, some spatial resolution detail, okay? With the caveat that if you could have used a slower speed film and the patient could have kept their heart still, you could have used that, right? But you can't. So we chose speed class of film based on the body parts we were radiographing and how quickly the exposures needed to be able to be made. Now you guys just think about exposure time, right? A film radiographer, radiographic technician would have to think, what should my exposure time be and what speed class of film should I be using for this exposure? So there was an extra thing to think about each time. Good news is, with CR and DR, the speed class is fixed. It's sort of a middle-of-the-road speed class, right around 200 or so. So you don't have to really think about it anymore since it's a constant. Okay? DR, as well as CR, operates at a consistent speed class. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and talk about, let me pause this recording. Now we're